New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
Good morning, everybody. Mark Gilbert here. Great to be back with you again on this continuing Saturday morning exploration of the Science of Mind textbook by Ernest Holmes. Today our chapter is chapter 14, Physical Perfection. And we're going to be going in through the book on this particular chapter. But I just want to remind everybody that if you're here live, be sure to post questions and comments. I'm glad to see that Fiona is here from Geneva and Wayne is here from Calgary, and that we know that there is a perfection in everybody who listens to this broadcast, both live and on the recordings as it's available online. As we've indicated, every week we go through one chapter of the Science of Mind textbook. And what I'd like to do is just start today by orienting ourselves as to where we are in the book. I think it's always kind of good to sort of reflect upon that. So what we have is there's various parts to the Science of Mind textbook. And yeah, we can put that slide back up. One of the things I want us to be aware of where we are in this overall flow. And this is something I didn't quite grasp when I was first studying the book. I just was reading through it and, and bouncing around in the book. But the very first part, the very first area is the introduction. But beyond that, we get into part one of the textbook, which is the big philosophy of the meaning of life, the nature of being, and all that kind of good stuff. But then it gets into part two, which is the spiritual mind healing, which is a key essence of the Science of Mind philosophy, that is using the power of thought to create our lives. And in that part two, it really is on the theory of the creative process. We now have moved into part three of the book, which is the spiritual mind healing, the actual practice, using the theorying and taking it into action. Later up, coming on in upcoming weeks, is part four, which is the perfect whole, that gets into the mystical aspects of the philosophy. And then part five is teachings from the New Testament and how they relate to Science of Mind. Part six is some meditations and treatments to give you examples of how to use the philosophy. And finally, there's a host of material at the very back of the book. That gives you the overall flow. But we're in part three of the book. And in part three, we're actually in chapter 14. And in chapter 14, and the reference to part three, that next slide, if we can see it for a moment, it gives us just the flow of this whole idea of putting the theory of spiritual mind treatment into practice. And like I said, we're in chapter 14. Last week was causes and conditions. And go back to slide. Causes and conditions. We're in physical perfection, which is basically about general ideas on Science of Mind treatment for physical healing. Next week, the presentation will be on chapter 15, where it gets into more specifics about using treatment for specific physical conditions. And then chapter 16 is the principles of successful living. You might look at that as using Science of Mind treatment for everything else in life beyond physical healing. And then there's some chapters 17 and 18 get into some specifics that you can actually use for Science of Mind treatment. That's mental equivalence and the law of attraction. All right, moving on. What we want to do now is get into chapter 14. I want to do just a quick overview before we get into the text itself. I want to talk about what ultimately is this chapter, where we're looking at the sort of the general ideas on the how to heal. What does that really mean for us? And so what I want to boil it down to is a certain concept. We'll go forward. This gets to something that is, we've heard the phrase before, as above, so below. That's basically a Hermetic concept that's come from many sources, but Ernest Holmes used it as the basis for a lot of the healing that we talk about. The as above is the world of consciousness and spirit, as below is the world of form. But those concepts come around from ancient traditions, going all the way back to the ancient Egyptians and Hermetic teachings from 2,000 plus years ago that taught the same concepts, that there was a multiple realms of existence, and that the realms that are above us match the realms that are below, that when we look at our physical form, that it's part of an overall structure of being. There's different realms of being. This concept was brought forward not only through the works of Plato, but also through, well known through the Emanuel Swedenborg, who had his law of correspondences. All of the ideas are essentially the same, is that there are multiple realms of being, and that the realms of being match. And if we can, when we're looking out at the world, and this physical world is so mesmerizing and hypnotizes us so much, that we think that all of the causes and conditions and everything are in the material world. And what this concept of as above, so below, or the law of correspondences reminds us of, is that there are these realms above us. We'll go to the next slide there for a second. These three realms, where we live is in this physical realm. This is what takes us into our attention every day. But above us are a couple of other realms that we can look at, and it's a mental realm and spiritual realm. And these realms are realms of being. Many people talk about the, different bodies, the physical body, the emotional, mental body, spiritual bodies. You can look at it from that concept, that there are energetic forms that are within the physical form, or we can look at it, they're higher up. However you want to visualize it and works for you is what's important. The real thing is just to get this idea of this map in our minds, that there are these multiple realms of being. And that what we want to do is to use the realms above us, the as above, so below, as a mechanism for healing us in the physical form here physically. Because this is, again, the life that seems so entrancing to us. Go on to the next one then. So, yes, just a visual there to give you an idea that, there is a realm beyond us, that we look at ourselves in the physical form, but that our physical form is actually a divine flow of energy and information coming from the spiritual realm down through the mental realm, and then manifest as the physical realm. It's also reflected in the science of mind teaching symbol when we look at spirit, law, and body. But there are these concepts, and this is what you really want to anchor into your awareness when you're using the concepts for any kind of healing, and especially physical healing, is to think in terms of matching what's in the higher forms into the lower form of the physical body. Next. So the bottom line of this chapter is that our goal in life is to shift our consciousness away from the conditions that we see in this physical realm and towards the perfection of the form in the person in the spiritual realm. Let me read that one more time. Our goal here is to shift our consciousness, our awareness, our thoughts away from the conditions that are in front of us, and see in this physical realm what we see in this physical realm, shift away from that and towards a perfection of forms that exist for that individual in the spiritual realm. And that's what we're attempting to do when we're using science of mind healing. Yes, and as Wayne indicates, that all things through Christ, we can look at the Christ consciousness as the spiritual consciousness, so that when we move up into the divine perfection of the forms that exist in the mind of the divine, what we're actually doing is tapping into that form and bringing that form into our awareness, and allowing that form then to manifest, to bring the as above, so below concept. Okay, now let's get into chapter 14 and into its specifics. And now that we've gotten sort of an overview of where the chapter is and the overall flow and what the general concept of it is, I want to take us to page 191 for a moment and get us started there. There's a key question that I think will anchor in what I was just talking about, key comment. And in this, on page 191, Ernest writes, "In this science, we believe that man's life is a drama which takes place on three planes: the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. So here he's saying very explicitly what I was just outlining. And he goes on to say later on in that page, we realize that mental healing must also be spiritual healing, for the two cannot be divorced. One way you can look at this is that, yes, we have a physical form, and then there's this highest spiritual realm, but in between is a mental realm that we can tap into. And that by the power of our thoughts and consciousness, it's sort of like a fulcrum, maybe on like a teeter-totter or something, or is where we can move into consciousness and shift our thinking towards the spiritual realm, and that allows them to be in alignment, and then that flows into the physical realm. And so Ernest really wants to anchor into us these three realms, and to realize that mental healing is really a spiritual healing, and that by bringing the spiritual aspect into the mental aspect, it's going to flow into the physical aspect as well. Let's go ahead and look on to page 192, and next slide. On 192, we get into a statement that I think is key, and gets into several concepts that Ernest outlined for us. He wants us to make the distinction, because it's really important that, when we start using mental healing, we think that, well, what's the difference in willpower and our intellect and imagination and concentration? So we actually spend several pages in this particular chapter making a distinction between willpower, intellect, imagination, and concentration. A lot of us think that when we get into mental healing, that we want to use our willpower to force something to happen, and he wants to tell us, no, that's not what the treatment process is about. Willpower is not the force that is the creative force. If we look at page 192, he says that we realize it's too much cannot be said. Too much cannot be said against the belief that willpower is creative. The will is directive, but not creative. Will is the conscious directive power of the intellect, and as such has a very important place in the creative order, but in no case is it to be used as though it would force things to happen. Very key here is to recognize that willpower is that aspect within you that allows you to direct your thoughts, but it's your thoughts and your intellect and your imagination that are actually the creative forces. They're the ones that are visualizing that perfect form in the divine. So the fact that your intellect, your conscious awareness, can tap into this spiritual form that is the physical perfection, the very nature that your mind can tap into and see, that is what is the creative aspect. What willpower does is actually helps focus you in that direction. So willpower is a directive force. Once you've chosen, you can sit down and think about any kind of question or issue. We do this a lot of times logically in our minds, is that we have an issue or a question before us in our lives, and we break it into several different scenarios, and we can visualize different scenarios and which one do we want. Do I want A? Do I want B? Do I want C? We've all go through the pros and cons of which one is the best one for us. And then we ultimately make a choice. And that's where willpower comes in. The imagination allows us to outline the various choices that we want in our lives. And then the willpower is the one that gives the energy behind moving and keeping us focused on the choice that we've made. So let's say we choose A over B, then whatever A is, we then use our willpower to focus our thoughts on the form of A to manifest it into our lives. As he says on page 193, the energy of mind, like other natural energies, always exists. It already exists. We merely use it. He adds, the imagination is creative. The will is directive. Let me repeat that. The imagination is creative. The will is directive. So when we imagine something, we know that is the correct form, and we make the choice that this is the form that we feel is the divine form that we want to manifest. And of course, when we're talking about physical perfection, we're talking about the physical health and well-being and perfect aspects of all expression of this physical form. We know that within the divine is a divine form that is perfect, that has no illness, that has no infirmary to it. And what we want to do is then focus on that and see that truth. And then we use our willpower to keep us focused on that. Okay. And he also says in the bottom of page 193 that as we should understand the proper use of the will, so we should understand the true meaning of concentration. Quoting over to page 194. To concentrate means to bring to center. And in mental science, it means focusing the mental attention on some definite and desired thought and image. Concentration of thought is not an effort to compel. To try to force through concentration would be to give ourselves an adverse suggestion and bring into ourselves the very opposite to our wishes through recognizing an opposite to the power of good. We concentrate our attention. So concentration, much like willpower, is a directive force. Once we choose what the highest vision is, what that form is that we wish to manifest, that physical health, then we use the power of our wills and we use our concentration to keep us on task. It's so much like, you basically say, oh, I want to be healed. I want this physical form to be in perfect form. And so I keep my thoughts in that way, but then I get distracted. So what concentration does is brings us back into that center where we stay focused on the perfect form that we want in life. So concentration is a key part of directing our thoughts and keeping them on in the direction that we wish to go. We staying on target, as Wayne says. We're using the force there. Yes. And so Fiona asks, so willpower is a co-creative force? It isn't. If you actually use the words, Fiona, that Holmes writes about, and it ties back to much of the writings of Thomas Troward, is neither one, and most New Thought teachers don't use willpower as a creative force. They use it as a directive force. And it's really a distinction. It's a force that humans can tap into for directing their thoughts, but the actual creative force is the thought itself. So what we're putting into that law, into that creative medium that Holmes talks about, is that imagination. So when we can imagine in our minds the physical perfection, let's say we have an illness that we're moving through, or we're working with somebody that has an illness, and then we can imagine themselves in their perfect health. That imagination, and holding that imagination and seeing that truth for them, and knowing that in the spiritual realm is that truth, that's actually the creative power. What willpower then is an aspect of our human nature that allows us to form directions to our thoughts, but it's the thought itself that is the will. Now, it may seem like it's parsing things out and nitpicking, and I think that the key factor here is just to remember that it's the thoughts and that imagination that we're holding in our minds, of that vision, that is what is creating. But when we get to start straying away from that vision, it's concentration that brings us back to center. It's the very fact that we know that we've made the choice, that we want perfect health, that we direct ourselves back into that thinking. So, I think in one level, you could say that they're a human ability and a human energy that we could use with the power of our imaginations to keep us on target. Okay. So anyway, let's move on, because now we have sort of like laid out some ideas about concentration, and I do want to read one other quote here on 194, which I think is good, because he sort of summarizes it all in that one. He says, a good psychological balance is struck when the will and the emotions are rightly poised. That is, when the intellect first decides what the emotions are to respond to. After the intellect has made this decision, then the imagination is called into play and the game of living commences. It is the office of the will to determine that to which the imagination is to respond. What is he saying there? Well, basically, that it is our will that makes the choice. It's our emotions that give power to it. It's the imagination that's actually the creative energy. It's our intellect that uses the will to decide, which is the correct direction, and brings them all together to keep us focused in the area that we wish to move. Okay. All right. So next slide. All right, moving on to page 196. This is a wonderful quote from Holmes that moves us into more on the aspect of physical perfection. He says, "We live in a universe of love as well as a universe of law." I want to stop there for a minute because one of the big sometimes comments people will make about Holmes is he doesn't talk about love enough. He talks about law. The law does this, the law does that. And this is one of those beautiful quotes where he really does bring in love so beautifully. He says, "We live in a universe of love as well as a universe of law. One is the complement of the other. The universe of love, pulsating with feeling, with emotion, and the universe of law, the executor of the feeling and all emotion. In this lesson on healing, then let us remember that back of the man which we see is the divine image." Again, he's hearkening back to that concept of as above, so below, that behind the physical form, we see the divine image. There is a perfect concept of man, humans, held in the mind of the universe as an already accomplished fact. But man, humans, are subject to the law of his own choice. So what we see is that this universe is filled with an energy of love. In fact, I often talk about the fact that love is an evolutionary force that's reminding us and allowing us to bring us out from the sense of separation into sense of connectedness with other people. So this universe is embedded with love. Yes, it's embedded with the law of the divine, the law that acts upon our thoughts, but also at the very heart of this universe is love. And so that's that love that has that perfect form in it. It's the divine love that says what your real truth is perfect health, perfect form. It's the love that points us to the highest expression of what we can be and who we are in life. Yes, the light bearer, as you're talking about, Wayne. Love is the key force that's directing us onto where we're going in this evolutionary journey of spiritual beings having this human experience. But it's the law that we're learning to act upon and use through the ability of our imagination and our creative thinking. Okay. Over on page 197, he says, "Healing then is accomplished by uncovering, neutralizing, and erasing false images of thought, and letting the perfect idea reflect itself through subjective mind into the body." Think about that. Healing then is accomplished by uncovering what? Uncovering false images that are in our consciousness. Uncovering the thoughts that are creating the condition that we're not wanting. And then neutralizing them and erasing these false images. And then letting that perfect idea from the as above flow into our awareness and then reflect itself through the subjective mind and into the body. So the call for us in healing is actually to root out any of the thinking that is creating the condition. Now, this can go down a long path of discussion about, what is it in your consciousness that created that physical condition? And I think that is it's a false argument that we don't really need to go into. What we have to look at is it's not a matter of blaming or saying you did X, Y, and Z in your thinking, and that's why you're having this condition. What it is a matter of is to not focus our energies upon what it is that might have led to that illness, but instead to say, okay, no matter what that might be or what led to that being, and it could have been all kinds of subconscious thinking that we weren't even aware of, is just to say, okay, let's let go of that and let's focus on that divine form. Let's focus on that spiritual image of what's the truth for the person. So the aspect of focusing on the negative thoughts is only to say where they may be giving some energy to it so that we can release them. But never, ever is it a sense for any kind of blame or negativity that we want to bring into life. Always it's to look at that condition, say, okay, these thoughts perhaps led to that, but let's turn away from them and look to the divine form and let's focus on that instead. Okay. So he says at the bottom of 197, we are limited not by principle, but by our own inability to see perfection. And again, the more that we focus on the thing that is in front of us in the physical form, the more we're not focusing on the perfection. And so that's why we continuously need to lift our consciousness and awareness up to see the spiritual truth of the individual in front of us or our own selves, so that we can then reflect that back down into physical form. It's going on over to page 198 now. This is one that if you get in very deeply into doing spiritual mind treatment, this is a key definition of treatment itself. And this whole section on starting on page 198 talks about spiritual mind healing. But he says, treatment is the act, the art, and the science of inducing thought within the mentality of the one treating, which thought shall perceive that the body of the patient is a divine, spiritual, and perfect idea. Let's break that down a little bit. Treatment. When we talk about treatment, we're of course talking about science of mind or spiritual mind treatment, where we're using either the method of argumentative, the 5-step treatment method, knowing oneness, knowing that we're part of the oneness, seeing the truth, having thankfulness, and then release. That's the argumentative step. Or there's also the direct realization method that Holmes taught, which is going straight to the truth and knowing it. But whatever method that we're using, the affirmative prayer method of treatment that we're using, Holmes tells us it's an act. Well, what do we mean by an act? It's a physical action that we're doing. We are taking an action, and that action often displays itself through words, but the words are only an outer expression of what is in the awareness of our consciousness. So when we speak a prayer, it doesn't have to be spoken, but when we speak an affirmative prayer, what we're doing is expressing outwardly the consciousness that is within us. So it's an act. He says it's an art. What do we mean by an art? Well, we know that an art is not just something that we rotely do. It brings in the heart of life. It brings in the aspect of the creative nature of ourselves. The fact that if you can think about an artist that's painting a picture, writing a book, doing anything of that nature, is creating an artistic endeavor, that there's a creative flow from the divine into the action that they're doing. So the very art of a treatment is allowing that divine creative energy that's expressed in artistic creations to also flow through us in the act that we're doing. So we're speaking and thinking in a way that has that artistic flow to it. And then he says it's a science. And what does he mean by science? Well, we all know the concept of science reflects the fact that we have a hypothesis, we test it, and then we see whether it's true or not. And so what he says is, let's test this process and let's see if it works. And for those of you who study it and are experienced in it, know that the process actually does work. So you have proven it to yourself in a scientific empirical method, that this process is a scientifically tested method of moving through the shifting of your consciousness to create a healing. So it's an act, it's an art with a creative endeavor, and it's also a scientific process in and of itself, and about inducing thought within the mentality of the one treating, the one doing the affirmation. And that thought is to perceive that the body of the patient is a divine, spiritual, and perfect idea. Again, going up to that perfect form that's in the spiritual realm, seeing it and knowing it within our own manifest mental realm, and then through that allowing that as above, so below process, the divine flow, the creative medium to act upon that. Yes, we are just looking at some of the comments here that Wayne and Fiona are making. Yes, it's all golden bubble of peace, white circle with silver ring. Yes, we're all with one. And I think the oneness is the key factor there, is to tie our awareness into awareness of the oneness of the divine, to see that everything is connected. Because especially when he talks about us treating for another person, we have to recognize, we have to break down the concept that how can I, through my creative use of spiritual mind treatment, impact a physical healing in another individual? As long as I see that other individual is separate and apart from me, that very thought breaks down the flow, and we have to have a oneness, the very nature of seeing everything interconnected. Much of quantum physics points to this, the non-local connection to everything that exists. Whatever it takes for us to shift our awareness into recognizing that everything is a divine oneness allows us to now see that not only is that oneness playing out in the world of form, but it's also a oneness that taps into higher levels of realms of being. The spiritual realm, the mental realm, the physical realm are all an interconnected oneness. And so that divine form that exists out there that says that we have a perfect body, that is part of the interconnectedness of all of life as well. And so what we want to see is that that's connected to this physical form, and that my thoughts are being spread, and the picture and the imagination that I'm using, the concentration that I'm keeping at it, and the will that I've chosen to direct that thought, that it is also an action that is impacting this other individual that I am attempting to heal, because we are interconnected. But it's all one. It's all one. Okay. Now, I like this over here on page 199. He talks about the fact that the practitioner is not trying to send out a thought, hold a thought, or suggest a thought. The practitioner is trying to realize the state of perfection of the person. We must be certain that we differentiate between a suggestion, which is okay as far as it goes, and the real metaphysical healing. He goes on to say on the bottom of that page, when one begins treating for another, there's sometimes a great sense of personal responsibility. You're feeling like you're the one having to do something. They've come to you and they say, will you treat for me? Will you do an affirmative prayer for me? Initially when you're first learning this stuff, you think, oh, I've got this great responsibility that's been put upon me. They've asked me to give a treatment for them. Well, it gets back to this divine oneness, this Christ energy, this flow of oneness that is in everything. If I start thinking that I have to be the one that is doing something, that very thought is breaking that flow of the oneness in my awareness. What I have to continuously stay anchored into is the oneness of the universe, and recognize that it's not my responsibility, that all I am doing is using the power of the creative thought that is within me as the spiritual being expressing as a human being, and tapping into that one energy and knowing and allowing the energy and the divine law to impact and create the manifestation that we're desiring. It's nothing that I have to force. He says that why is this? Because we shift that sense of responsibility down to its last analysis. It's a belief that you cannot heal. Do not give in to that belief, not even for a second, because it's nothing but a thought which says you cannot heal. Nothing but a thought is saying, or could be saying, and since it's only a thought which says it, it's only a thought which unsays it. Declare my word has the power to heal. What he's talking about there is really, that breakdown in the oneness. If you think that, how do I have the ability to heal? If it's only a thought, how's that thought going to create anything? When we start getting over into that realm of arguing with ourselves about the power of the mind, power of big mind to manifest form, then we're actually getting out of the flow. And the very key nature that we need to maintain and focus on is being in that divine flow. In fact, I've often said that if you're doing an affirmative prayer and you go through the first two steps, knowing oneness and that you are a part of that flow of oneness, and then all of a sudden you don't feel it, stay in that aspect of the flow until you feel it, because you have to actually convince yourself of the oneness. It's something that's going on in your awareness that says, okay, I really don't have the power, and these are just thoughts, and they're not going to have any creative ability. Then you're going to manifest not having creative ability in those thoughts. And so what we have to do is stay focused and in tune with the infinite, as Ralph Waldo Trine said. We have to stay in tune with the infinite and use our prayers in the first two steps of affirmative prayer to stay anchored in tune with the infinite, and then know the truth. If we feel that we're getting out of in tune with the infinite, flow back in your prayer into those first two steps. Stay in that flow of the divine love that's within you. And from that awareness, then speak the truth. Okay. Continuing on, he says over here on, I love this over on page 200. He says the word dis-ease means lack of ease, dis-ease. Abnormal is absence of a normal condition. What that means is ease is our natural state. Ease is our normal state of being. Health is our normal state of being. It is when we get out of the normal state of ease that we have dis-ease. When we get out of normality that we have abnormality. What we want to do is to break the chain of causation in the physical realm that has led into whatever the state of dis-ease is, and return our thoughts up to the sense that there is this perfection in God, which gets to the words over on the bottom of 201, where Holmes says that man is fundamentally perfect. Humans are fundamentally perfect. This is the whole premise of this teaching, is that we are perfect. Perfect God, perfect man, perfect being. Perfect, whole, and complete. Within the idea of God, God in itself, spirit, the oneness, it's perfect. Yes, we see lots of evidence that we can argue with in the world of form that makes it look like it's not perfect. But ultimately, when we can step back from it and examine it from the farthest standpoint and see it from its broadest perspective, we recognize that all of God is perfect. Even those things that may be less than what we desire in the world of form ultimately played some gift in the evolutionary journey for the individual or humanity or life itself. There is a perfection at play. And if we can focus and keep that perfection in mind, then we see that also within that perfect God is an understanding and a desire for that ease and normality and the perfect expression of the human. Hence, he says perfect man. Perfect man. So ultimately, at the spiritual level, we're all perfect beings as well. And finally, perfect being. We're all perfect beings. And what is a being? What is a being? You know, we make the distinction typically in metaphysical teaching between a being and becoming. A being is something that it is in its timeless, eternal state. It is its beingness. Becoming is the actions that we take when we move through the world of time and the relative world of form. So we can look at this in many places. We can look at it that the world of spirit, the spiritual realm, is the absolute realm, the divine realm, that divine location, if we want to use the word location, where there is our beingness rest in perfection. But down here in the physical realm, we're continuously in relative nature to other things. In the relative realm, we're moving through time and space. In the spiritual realm, we're anchored in being. We're becoming continuously in the physical realm. We're continuously being in the spiritual realm. And our mental realm is tapping. It's like a bridge that connects us between the two. And so what we're trying to attempt to do here is to step into that state of being that has that divine perfection for perfect God, perfect man, perfect being. And through our mental abilities of thought, imagination, concentration, using our willpower to keep us focused, we're trying to bring that perfection that we see in the state of being down into this state of becoming, where we're continuously flowing and moving and changing in a divine dance. Moving on. On pages 202 to 207, Holmes then talks about how to heal. And he says, in our work, we treat man not as a physical body. Neither do we treat the disease as belonging to him. The reason being that if we do, we cannot subsequently free him from it. What is he saying there? That we focus on the perfection in the spiritual realm. We don't focus on the physical body. This is real hard for us because so much of our day we focus on the physical realm. But we really have to keep our eyes lifted up. And I gotta say, up is a relative word here. Somebody asked me this recently. How do we know above and below? And really, it's only words to help us form in our mind a mental image of looking beyond the physical form. But we're looking to an area where we know at some level it's higher mind, higher sense of the being of life. Okay, but we're not focused on the physical nature. Then he says, first recognize your own perfection, then build up the same recognition for your patient. Focus, recognize your own perfection. You and I are perfect. We're perfect. Yes, our physical expressions sometimes are not. Sometimes our actions are not. In the world of becoming, we're not always acting in a way that's in alignment with our beingness. But at our state of the spiritual realm, we are always perfect. Focus on that and build up that same recognition for the patient in front of you, the person that you're working with. And then you're ready to directly attack the thought that binds him, recognizing that your word destroys it and stating that it does so. You may then take into account and specifically mention everything that needs to be changed, every so-called broken law or false thought, and finish your treatment with a realization of peace. What he's ultimately saying is focus on the divine perfection in the spirit realm. Turn away from any conditions that are in front of that. Where you've recognized that there's been any kind of thinking that has led to that, negate that and focus on the opposite of it. And then finish with this realization of peacefulness in your heart. That's the process. And then jumping over just to page 204 for a moment. So we come into closure on today's lesson. I thank you for those of you who've been making comments and listening, and those of you who are listening to the recording. But on page 204, Holmes gives a great example of a short prayer that you could use. He says, repeat the following. God is all. There is but one power, intelligence, and consciousness in the universe, but one presence. This one presence cannot change. There is nothing for it to change into but itself. It is changeless, and it is my life now. It is in me now. These words, which he has in quotes on 204, can serve as a great starting point for personal affirmations, to anchor your awareness into the fact that all there is God. And remember that continuously the process of healing, and next week when they get into specifics regarding the aspects of using science of mind treatment for particular physical ailments, is that ultimately behind all of it is a shifting of our attention away from what we're seeing in front of us in the world of form, in that physical realm. And we're moving upwards into the mental realm and anchoring our awareness in that higher spiritual realm where there is a divine form that sees wholeness, perfection, anchoring our truth in that, anchoring our energy in that, anchoring our concentration in that. And as we can do that, we can use the power of the science of mind, the power of our thoughts, the creative power that's been the gift given to us to manifest the greatest and highest lives possible, including physical perfection. So thank you for watching today. I hope this has been beneficial. Be sure to drop comments in, even if you're watching the recording. And just know that each and every one of us is blessed by this wonderful gift, the power of creative thought. Thanks again.
Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Denver, for your continued support. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Midtown Atlanta, for your monthly contribution. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living North Jersey, for your monthly contribution. And please help us welcome Om Center for Spiritual Living in La Mesa, California. Thank you for your monthly donation. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Seattle, for your most generous donation. And a special thanks to Hefferlin Foundation for your generous technology grant. And Suze Ajit, thank you for your very generous donation. And a super special thank you to Dr. Tracy Brown, RSCP. Thanks for being a super donor. And a big shout out to all our committed donors.